Okay.
This is good.
So Four Noble Truths, to mention it, firstly, are the truth of suffering, truth of the cause of suffering, truth of the cessation of suffering, and the truth of the path, or you can also say like the truth of path of cessation of suffering, but it's like truth of path. So the truth of suffering, firstly, we need to understand in order to practice the Dharma or the teaching taught by the Buddha. To understand it, to become the practitioner of Dharma, if we do not understand Four Noble Truths, or in other words, we are not even eligible to become a Buddhist practitioner if we do not learn and understand Four Noble Truths. And you need to also agree with the view of Four Noble Truths. If you don't have the view of the Four Noble Truths, or you don't agree with the view of Four Noble Truths taught by the Buddha, then it's probably not the suitable thing for you. In the first day, I also said about you being suitable for Buddhism and Buddhism being suitable for you or not. So that's one of the point, because if you do not agree with the Four Noble Truths philosophy, then probably you are also not suitable for Buddhism. Buddhism is also not suitable for you. So whether you are interested in Buddhism or not, anybody can investigate, research about Four Noble Truths. So it's their choice whether you agree or not with the Four Noble Truths. And also, as Buddha has said, I teach the suffering. So firstly, Buddha has taught the suffering, the reality of suffering. Truth of suffering means the reality of suffering. And before beginning with the Four Noble Truths, we also need to understand, especially the new beginner Buddhist practitioners, that Buddha taught the truth of suffering not to make you pessimistic or feel you mentally negative. It's not like you should feel very bad about, oh, everything is suffering, so you keep suffering, you keep worrying, you keep having negative thoughts about the life in the world, life in the samsara. It's not like that. Because Buddha taught the suffering because he had found the cause of the suffering. If Buddha would need to teach suffering without finding the cause of the suffering, without finding the solution, then he wouldn't need to go to the jungle. He had seen the suffering while he was prince in his palace. But after he went to the jungle, he found the other of Three Noble Truths, which means the solution of the suffering, solution of the samsara. So in order to understand the first truth, which is the suffering of truth, we can understand the truth of suffering by categorizing it with its three main categories. Yeah, that's what we call. So, so the truth of suffering and firstly the term called samsara. You've heard the word, right? Samsara is it's like the meaning of world, but it's not exactly world only. It also represents the suffering of the world, and in other words, the samsara is described as the ocean of suffering also. So the life in samsara, in any realms, in any life, is just about suffering, is just to experience the suffering. And before going to the categories of the suffering, we can understand that in our normal social language, we use the words like happiness and suffering, happy moments, embarrassing moments, bad moments. But what we can understand is, if we go deeply, if we think deeply, everything is suffering when you have this mundane body and you have this life in the mundane world. That means the suffering you experience, without doubt you can understand is suffering, but also the happy moments is just like forgetting some bad moments. Like people do these entertainment things, and but mostly it's like forgetting the suffering. Like the entertainment you do in your holiday weekend. So the whole weekday you work hard because you want some kind of satisfaction, some kind of happiness. So you think at the end of the week I will make myself happy. At the end of the year I'll make myself happy. So that's like one day in a week and 1 month in a year. You make a plan to make yourself happy. But again, the activity you do in your weekend and in the year end is just mostly like forgetting the sufferings you had. Because if you do not know how to experience the happiness, the real happiness, then it's just about like forgetting those sufferings. Because if you experience the happiness, you can bring the happiness from one day to your weekday also. But it was just about forgetting the suffering. So while you are enjoying something in your weekend, you have this this imprint of your suffering throughout the week. So you are trying to relax, and as the weekend finishes very fast, and you also have this worry of, oh, I have to start working tomorrow, and like it's always there. So your mind is unable to free yourself, and even in that situation, it's not like complete happiness. It's not like real happiness. It's just like trying to forget the suffering. So now, to go to the categories of suffering, if you understand the categories of the suffering, so we could understand probably the teaching of suffering, the truth of suffering is true. The first category, we call it suffering of suffering. For example, the pain like the heat when some fire or some in the spring season, right? It's very hot, right? Do we call it spring or which season? Anyway, before the summer is like spring, and it's too hot. In some part of world you have 40-50 degrees hot, and then it becomes difficult to live in there. And cold, like in the evening and in the morning, nowadays also, if we try to go outside without not much cloth, then it's too cold. Right now also we're feeling cold, right? So we have hot, we have cold, and also there is like from the 6 realms we call them like hell. So hell realm is also like full of suffering the hot and suffering the cold. But beyond that, other things we can consider with the suffering of suffering is which we can really realize that the suffering is happening, the pain is happening, and mainly like what we want, what we desire, and when it does not happen, you want something, it does, you don't get it, then you have the suffering. And also which you do not want, and when you get it, you have the suffering. For example, you don't want accident, you don't want failure, but you fail. You don't want accident, but like small accidents keep happening. Sometimes you strike your hand in some wall, sometimes you, in Nepal there's like very small door, and even I also sometimes hit my head into the door. So it keeps happening until we have this body. We also have accidents every time. And also maybe anyways, I will go through that later. So anyway, in the Buddha's teaching, in the sutra, we call it sutra teaching. In the sutra, Buddha has explained the first category, which is the suffering of suffering. in this way. Suffering of suffering is that the painful when arising, painful when remaining, and pleasant when changing. So when we have this hot, we have this cold, and when we have some accident, when we have some disease, and when we have fever, when we have diarrhea, so all of these things. And so now we can understand, it's painful when arising. So when fever arises, we suffer. When somebody slaps us, somebody punches us, also we suffer. When we have accident, we suffer. Because when it's arising, it's painful. And when it's remaining, then also it's painful. So the disease also remaining within us. We have accident, we have some wound. And the wound is also wound, we have fracture, we have injury. And that's also, till the injury is there, we suffer. But when it's changing and it is pleasant, it's happy. Like you have some disease, when you heal from the disease, then you feel happy. So that is the suffering of suffering. Until it changes, when it arises, when it is there remaining, and is suffering, is painful. And number 2, the second category is the suffering of change. And suffering of change is that which is pleasant when arising, pleasant when remaining, but painful when ceasing. So it's like the opposite. For example, like the same thing I told about the holidays. So holiday starts, is happy, is pleasant, and when it's remaining, when the holiday is not finished yet, is also happy. You are enjoying, you are entertaining yourself. But when it finishes, it's very painful. Like the death. Death also, when death is for life, like when the life ends and we have the death, we suffer. So everything, the ending thing is always suffering. So here we also have to mention the birth, getting sick, getting old, aged, and then dying. So all of them are suffering in some sort. And the third category of the suffering is not apparent when it arises. When it's arising, you don't know, it's not apparent. When it remains or ceases. So the third category of suffering, we call it all-pervasive suffering of conditions. Sorry?
Yes.
Condition or conditional something?
Suffering of conditioning. In the book, this is...
conditioning, yeah.
Yes.
It's called conditioning, okay. So all-pervasive suffering of conditioning is the third category. So it said that when it arises, when it remains, when it finishes, you don't know. But is still the cause of suffering. So when we understand these three, the first and second are opposite. First is when you realize the pain, but when the pain ends, you feel little bit happiness. And the second one is the worldly happiness. It's not the real happiness, it's materialistic happiness. So when it's there, when it starts, when it's there, you feel the happiness. Like you can consider like the music, like the movie also. When it's there, you enjoy. But when it finishes, you don't feel good. Oh, the movie is finished. That's why I also keep saying in like the 6 realms. You know the 6 realms, right? So the first one, the highest realm is what? God realms. The lowest one is hell realm. But like normally people say you go to hell because you go there to suffer. You go to experience suffering there. So probably the biggest suffering is in the hell. But in my perspective, there is one possibility which I consider like probably the God realm has the biggest suffering. Because it is said that in the last, when the life in the God realm is about to end, like from few weeks ago, you can see, few weeks earlier, you can see that where I am going to born, what kind of suffering I will suffer. And you also see if you are going to hell, if you are going to animal realm, if you are going to ghost realm. So like the week work, Monday to Friday, you work, it's hard work, but you can also kind of enjoy. It's not that hard to work while you are working. But when in the holiday, you think about the work, is so painful. Oh, I need to work this whole 6 days. So, in one perspective, you can think like that in the holiday, while you are thinking about the work, is more painful than working itself. Because while you are working, you get used to it. Also, for another example, like last few months ago, I went to the hottest place of Nepal, and I felt like I was put inside the micro oven. I reached the hottest place of Nepal. It's called Nepalganj. So it was about 40 degrees. So I felt like I was into micro oven. In my childhood, I have lived there. I have lived there from 1993 to 1996. At that time, I did not feel like that. But now when I suddenly go there, I feel like that. Because in my childhood, or the people who are living there, you are used to. You always see, you always feel that heat, that hotness. So it's not problem. You have 40 degrees, but you don't have problem because you are used to. But when you are coming from Kathmandu and suddenly you are into Nepalganj in the hottest season, then it's like very difficult. Like whole day I was bathing and again sweating, again bathing, again sweating. So now we can understand that suffering itself is also not that difficult if you have constantly the experience of suffering. But when you have suddenly, you need to experience that suffering, it's very big. It's very difficult.
Because in the work also, you can get hard work, but finally like it.
Yeah.
And okay, I will not maybe speak about...
Hard work is not that hard when you are working.
Yes.
You keep working, it's not hard.
Otherwise you couldn't work.
Yeah. But when you think about that much work I have to do, or you haven't done work from some years, and now you suddenly need to do that work, it is difficult. For example, I was, maybe I have already said, I was good in maths in my school. So I liked formula. I solved many problems, mathematical problems. Even some senior students asked me to solve problems in my school. And I also was good in like art painting. But now, now when I try, I'm unable to solve the math problems. I'm unable to do good paintings, good art, because I am not used to now. I am only used to study Buddhism, teach Buddhism, meditate Buddhism, think Buddhism. So those are the two categories. The second one is change. The change is suffering here. First one is the suffering itself. Second one is the change. When the happiness, the worldly happiness ends, it's always biggest suffering. And the third one is the cause of both them. It's like the foundation. And why it's called the all-pervasive suffering of conditioning? Because it is the condition, it is the cause. It's not the fruit of suffering, it's the cause of suffering. So it's not like the truth of cause of suffering, but because you have this cause of suffering, your karma behind you, so now you need to suffer. That means you need condition. You feel like drinking coffee, so you bring the tea, and now you need to cook also, like cook the tea and pour it into the cup. So you need the conditions also. Without conditions, like without this cup, you cannot drink the tea. The tea is the cause, but the cup is the condition. So this cup is also like similar to our body. If we don't have our body, if we don't have our human life, we cannot experience the suffering and happiness of the world, of the mundane world. So that's why it's called, it is not apparent when it arises, remains, or ceases, but it is still the cause of suffering. In fact, it is the biggest suffering. For example, you can hire some vehicle. You can get a ride on some car, some bike by paying 100 rupees, 1000 rupees. But when you spend like few thousands of dollars, you can buy yourself one vehicle. So when vehicle is there, you always drive, you always have the ride. In the same way, when you have the conditioning, then you can always suffer. You have it's like the license. You got the license, you got the certificate to suffer.